Amen. Well, good evening. It's good to be with you tonight. I'm going to start. So this evening we are talking about education. We're kind of titling the whole evening A Revolution in Education. In this first lecture, I want to kind of talk about the present lay of the land for us. So I don't know what you think about when you think about education when you come in the room, but I want to start just by putting all my cards on the table. I think education is war. Education is a battleground. Education is a fight. Now, you may not be able to say that it's the most important battleground there is, but it's undoubtedly one of the most significant and essential battlegrounds in all of human life. I want to, again, start with this idea, just to full disclosure for you from the outset. I believe that education is one of the primary places that a society or a community or a culture is called to fight, and I use that word really intentionally, for the well-being and the flourishing of our young. However, I find many people in general, and many parents in particular, do not see it this way, which creates a remarkable tension point when we think about the biggest issues of education, schooling, and the raising of our young. I imagine that most of us in this room are aware to some level that there is a crisis, you could say a war, happening within the education system in our country. Over the last several years, we've each seen, whether through the news or experiences in our own classrooms, an increasingly radicalized, left-leaning, progressive agenda finding its way into classrooms and curriculum all across our nation. This press, the increasingly radicalized ideology that's being introduced into schools, has forced many parents, and many Christian parents particularly, to begin asking questions about where they might find refuge from this growing storm. In the face of such a radical lean, there's a common sentiment that emerges. I've heard it often from parents, and it sounds something like this. As we get a little older, we start to sound old. It just happens. It sounds a little bit like this. Why can't we just go back to schooling the way that it was when I was a kid, right? Or maybe, why can't we just get back to the basics? Just teach my kids to read or to do math or teach them history. Essentially, the sentiment is a type of nostalgic idea that believes education or that school should be a place free from ideological battles. And although I understand and have some compassion for the sentiment, I hope to argue this evening that the sentiment itself actually betrays a somewhat simplistic way of perceiving education as a neutral place. And that this way of viewing education is actually part of why Christians specifically are finding ourselves late to the game, so to speak, in a battle that's happening over the hearts and minds of our children and leaving us wondering what in the world should we do about it. So tonight, my desire, as with each of these lectures, is to try and give us a broad framework for understanding what is happening in the educational system around us, as well as seek to provide biblically informed answers to help us as the people of God know what we should do in times like this. To do that, in this first lecture, I'm going to try and lay out a framework for what I think education is, and then outline a very brief history of education in the Western world. My hopes in doing this is to demonstrate two things. First, that education is not neutral, or you could say it differently again, education is a battleground. And second, to demonstrate that simply going back a generation in order to return to the quote-unquote basics is an insufficient solution and will not provide the people of God a viable, healthy, or even sustainable way of thinking about the education of our children. This will then lead to my second lecture, where I hope to lay out somewhat of a framework for a possible way forward for us as believers, for us as churches, in thinking about education. So to begin, we have to ask the question, what is education? I imagine for many of us, the idea of education is simply conceived of as school. Or if you were pressed a little, you might conceive of it as a progression of, you could say maybe like schooling events through various contexts. So you have elementary, you have secondary, you have college. You have this progression of schooling events through which a student receives the requisite information and skills required to be a successful participant in our society. Or you could say it a little more frank, or maybe even a little more crassly, to say school is what you do to get a job. Now, this concept of education is insufficient for a myriad of reasons, some of which I hope to undo tonight, but I want to highlight a couple at the outset. First, as I hope to show later, this picture of education actually betrays a much bigger view of the world that does actually answer the questions that an educational system should answer, but answers them in a profoundly anemic and insufficient way. And we'll get to that in a minute. But second, this concept of education is faulty because it essentially reduces education to a process of transmitting information. This concept further establishes the earlier idea that we might have of a nostalgic return to days when we just taught the subjects, or when education wasn't about ideology or an agenda. However, I hope you take this away tonight. Education is always about an ideology. It is always about an agenda. Let me give a working definition for education. And I want to say this on the front end. This definition is an attempt to give a short, concise definition to something that's going to take us a lot of time to unpack and illustrate and comprehend. For those of us that have grown up thinking that education equals information, this concept is going to take a little time. It's going to seem a little fuzzy. I just want to tell us this on the front end as we try to unpack it. So I hope you hold on with me through the process. But because definitions matter, here it goes. Education, in my opinion, is the process through which a society enculturates its young to acquire its identity, its values, its norms, and its practices. Essentially, education is the process that forms individuals into the culture of a society so that they can become a meaningful participant within a broader community, ordering their life for what you might call the common good of the society as it's perceived based on perceptions of what matters, what is successful, how do you best play a part in the community. This definition of education is built on several presuppositions. First, it's built on a presupposition that every society or every community has a sense of identity. And an identity is just answers to questions like, who are we? Or where do we come from? What's our heritage? What's our history? So every society has an identity. Every society has a set of values. These are answers to questions like, what matters? How are we successful? How do we participate within this community? So we have an identity, we have values, we have norms and practices that govern how we interact and participate within the community. All of these things, identities, values, norms, practices, go into making up what we would call, or partly at least, a culture or the culture of a society. Now, this leads us to the second presupposition. That culture is held by a community, and the survival of that culture requires that this complex set of assumptions and answers to life's biggest questions be transmitted or passed down from one generation to another. Or said differently, the society needs a way to enculturate its young into its ways. Let me give a picture or a story to try to illustrate this for us. The author, David Foster Wallace, he told what has become a really somewhat well-known story to illustrate the idea of culture, particularly the ideas that we assume, but we don't always have full awareness of. The complex set of shared identities, values, norms, practices. He told a story of two young fish swimming around together one day having a conversation. As they're swimming together and talking, they swim by this older fish. And as the older fish passes them, he calls out to them, "Good morning, fellas. How's the water?" They kind of have a puzzled look on their face, and they swim by him. And when he's outside of earshot, they turn to each other, and they look at each other, and they go, "What in the world is water?" This idea illustrates for us, I think, a helpful way to picture what I'm talking about when we try to define education. There is a water that we all swim around in society. It's the normative part of our lives that most of us don't even know what it is day in and day out. It's the air we breathe, the images and the pictures, the hopes, the desires that we hold on to. Oftentimes not even in concrete, reasoned, or logical expressions, but we hold on to in pictures and desires and in longings. So in my way of thinking, education is not teaching our children what the water is. Rather, it is actually taking them and putting them into the water and teaching them how to swim. To state it a little differently, another author called Stefan Zweig once wrote, "What a man takes into his bloodstream in childhood from the air of his time stays with him." Now, what Zweig is getting at here is what I believe is fundamental to the concept of education. What a child takes into their bloodstream, not just the information, but the assumptions, the values, the shared identities, the norms, the practices. What they take into their bloodstream about these things at a young age will stay with them all throughout their lives. You could say that this is an Eastern European author's way of saying what Solomon said so long ago: train up a child in the way they should go, and even when he's old, he will not depart from it. So this could lead us to argue that education is more about assumptions than it is about information. So what are the assumptions that education should be built upon? Although there are likely many things you could discuss, I think every educational system or every program of education is built on two foundational first principles, or you could say assumptions, that give shape to how education happens. These two principles come as the answers we give to two basic questions. The first question is teleological in nature and asks the question, what are humans for? This question is a question about purpose, a question about goals, a question about the end that we are oriented toward, which is what teleological means. Essentially, the answer to this question shapes a massive part of education and is absolutely foundational. Think about it this way. If humans are for gainful employment so that they can be productive members of a consumer society, then education will be oriented toward enculturating its young toward that end. If people are for, and we're going to get to this later, this is going to come out, but this is the world that we live in right now. This is when you feel butting up against the radical things that you see on the news or you feel in the classrooms, the ideology that is pressing down into the education system, this is what it is. If humans are for being social or political activists whose aim is to challenge the status quo and undermine and tear down and replace American society, then educational systems will be oriented toward enculturating young toward this end. We'll get back to this later. However, If people are made in the image of God, then the telos of humanity is to live in communion with our Creator and conform in our lives to His truth, His laws, His ways. Then educational systems should be oriented toward enculturating our young toward that end. We'll also return to that later. So the second question that comes and informs the assumptions that are answered by any educational program are questions of anthropology. If the first ones were teleological, what are humans for? The second assumptions have to do with what does it take to get people there? The answer to this question includes a whole set of other presuppositions, like what makes up a human? Right? Are we just brains that need to be full? Are we reasoning beings that need to just have the right information? Are we emotional, subjective beings that just need to be trained in how to fight against the status quo because of our perceived emotions? How do we perceive of what makes up a human? And then how do we think humans get toward the end that we're aiming at? If the first question informs the ends or the goal of education, then the second question informs the means. So let me lay it out again. If humans are for gainful employment in a production consumer society, then they need certain knowledge and skills to find such employment. Then education, by necessity, becomes about transmitting this information and these skills to the young. This has been predominantly the way that education has been for the last 100 years, kind of post-World War II in America. Now, if people are for social activism, then they need to be trained socially or politically to be literate in those ways, particularly as it pertains to the plight of so-called victims. This is going to radically alter the context of the classroom, moving it from a place of information transfer, which even then requires a level of authority or knowledge, to a place where dialogue and egalitarianism and equalitarianism reign, with a slow shift away from any form of authority or hierarchy, even for teachers and administrators, to a realm of discovery and subjectivity. I hope that you can see a little bit that education is built on these assumptions. What are people for, and how do we get to that end? I hope this also begins to paint a picture for you of why education is actually always a battlefield. If education is related to culture and enculturation, then there is no such thing as a neutral education. Education is always informed by an ideology. It is not whether it's informed by an ideology. It is not whether it is enculturating our young. It is what is the culture that is enculturating them? What ideology is shaping it? Now, to return to our opening remarks, there is a crisis in the educational system in our moment, in the West, in America in particular. However, I'd say that it's more than just a crisis of falling test scores or debates about so-called critical theories as they get introduced into the classroom. I believe what we're seeing today in education is the fruit, and I think it is rotten fruit, of seeds that were planted in the soil of the educational field quite some time ago. Now, if you've been tracking with us over the last couple lectures, this should start sounding kind of familiar to you. So what's happening in our moment is the maturation of nothing less than what is a radical revolution in education that's been in the work for some times now. So to understand how this unfolding reality of education actually is a radical revolution, we need to familiarize ourselves just briefly, ever so briefly, with the history of education in the Western world. The history of the education in the Western world, like the history of Western civilization as a whole, is the product of two kind of unlikely companions. The first source of the educational approach is the educational system that had been discovered and produced by the Greeks. It would be untrue or unfair or something like that to say that Greeks developed or discovered education, right? Because every culture and society seeks to pass down its ideals and values from generation to generation. However, the unique achievement of the Greeks was the attempt to found its educational principles and its practices and even its culture on universal principles that could be adopted by non-Greeks as well as Greeks. This transition is significant because it's the first society in human history, at least recorded human history, that ordered itself around a set of ideals or a culture rather than around a national heritage or exclusively around bloodlines. An early Greek rhetorician named Isocrates, which is not to be confused with the philosopher Socrates, throw an I in front of it. He stated that the people that we call Greeks are those that have the same culture as us, not the same blood. So the Greeks were highly intentional. They were very thoughtful and determined in their pursuit of how to train young members of the society to be conformed into this culture. Now, the Greek word for culture or ideal here is a word that's going to come up for us a few times tonight. It's a word called paideia. For the philosophers, the source of this ideal, this culture, this principles that existed was an ultimate and universal reality that existed beyond our material world. And individuals need to be trained or disciplined into being conformed to this ideal. Education, therefore, was an attempt to give the necessary tools or skills, these were called arts by the Greeks, to moderate the latent, base, individualistic, selfish, and perverse desires that every person has in order to be conformed to this ideal. Or to say it differently, the point of education for the Greeks was to promote the full development of human faculties in order that they existed together in a harmony, in conformity with true knowledge and true virtue, and that our appetites were conformed around what was truly beautiful. And these were to be conformed to things that were objective and standard and fixed and existed outside of the individual's desires, outside of their experiences, and outside of their preferences. The importance of this task is highlighted by Plato in his Republic when he says, the beginning of everything we undertake is most important, especially among any young and tender creature. That is when it's most malleable and when whatever character you desire to be stamped on the individual is fixed. What a young child takes into his bloodstream from the air of his time when he's young, he will not depart from. Train up a child in the way they should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Over time, the Greeks developed a system of arts or skills that people were to be trained in order to receive the formation of mind and soul that allowed them to perceive the whole of reality, to perceive what was true, to perceive what was good, and to perceive what was beautiful. These 7, what came to be known as the liberal arts, were not subjects that were to be taught as we think of them today, but were 7 tools that were necessary for an individual to perceive, to understand, and ultimately, this really matters, to be conformed to reality. As the Greeks expanded throughout the world, they built cities that were intended to be embodiments of their cultural ideal. And at the heart of these cities were schools intentionally designed to pass down and guarantee the succession of their cultural ideal. Although it's hard for us to grasp, again, as we will see, we're so trained to think of education as simply information transfer. It's hard for us to grasp that the purpose of education in the Greek world was neither economic, meaning it wasn't about attaining wealth, nor was the ideal of education utilitarian. It wasn't about the utility that it provided to us as individuals. It was the training required for a person to live in accordance with reality, an ordered, harmonious life, which was thought to be the only life that was truly well lived. The arts, or these tools, were only beneficial inasmuch as they trained the mind and the affections and the will to perceive what was ultimately true and good and beautiful and be conformed in all of life to those realities. From this, we can make a few preliminary observations about the nature of the Greek idea, the paideia. First, it perceived that humans were for living a well-ordered life conformed to reality. This meant that the highest good, or the goal, or the end, was for a person to live in accordance with what was true. And it was believed that that truth was objective and fixed and perennial and existed outside of the individual. Because of this, we can see, secondly, that the goal was to be pursued by putting the necessary instruments into the hands of individuals, whereby their faculties, their minds, their appetites or desires, their wills could be trained to be moderated and disciplined into conformity with what is ultimately true and good and beautiful. Okay, I want to pause for just a second. If you are, as I imagine some of you, feeling a little foggy right now, like you're looking at me going, what in the world are you even talking about? Like you understand that all of the words that I'm saying are English words, but when you put them together, you're like, I don't know that they mean anything. You're feeling like, this is gonna be a cheesy dad joke, this is all Greek to me. Hey, it's okay. In some ways, this is like speaking a different language. It's going to take time. There's fogginess to it. There's a cloud to it. It is a different way of perceiving the entirety of the world, one that is vastly different than ours. It's like being taken from one water and being plunged into another. It is like, I was thinking about it this way today. It is like somebody walking up to you and looking at you and going, the sky is yellow and the sun is blue. And there are people throughout a lot of human history that have really believed that the sky was yellow and the sun is blue. And you're like, I have to deconstruct and relearn all of my world. That's okay. That's where we are. I imagine that's where a lot of us are. But my hope is not that you comprehend in fullness, but that a seed gets planted one day that maybe will bear some fruit in our lives. So this brings us to our second source that shaped the educational and cultural heritage of the Western world, which is Christianity itself. Christianity obviously is built upon the belief that the true God, has created all things. He revealed himself to his people, and he himself is leading all of his creation toward a purpose that exists within the counsel of his own will. For the people of God, humans exist for the purpose of living in communion with God and organizing our lives and our world around his purposes and his ideal. The Bible possesses a clear vision for the importance of enculturating children into the ways of the Lord, one that shaped both the unfolding Jewish and early Christian communities. In the Old Testament, God commanded his people through Moses to intentionally instruct their children in the ways of the Lord. Hear Deuteronomy 6:4-9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. These words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children and shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise. You shall bind them as signs on your hand. They will be like frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on your doorposts of your house and on your gates. We move into the New Testament. Paul commands fathers to bring up children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. However, what might not be abundantly evident in this simple command is that Paul is not talking primarily just about parenting your children, nor is he talking about discipline in the sense of, we might say, like spanking them or something. He is telling fathers to take up the task of bringing up their children in the paideia that belongs to God. This Greek word that we talked about earlier, about the ideal and the culture that they embodied. The word that we translate discipline, Paul uses is paideia. As I've sought to show, this word would have been one of the most culturally charged words to his hearers. They are Hellenistic Greek descendants who lived in the city of Ephesus. Essentially, what Paul is exhorting here is much more than just the practice of discipline, and much more than we contemporarily conceive of as education. Paul is exhorting fathers to oversee the development and the formation of their children into the ways, the ideals, the values, and the identities that are essential to live as faithful citizens in God's heavenly city, his heavenly kingdom. As we looked at in the first lecture a few months ago, it was the Christian interaction and the utilization at times of the Greek ideal that led to the predominant worldview of the West for nearly 1,500 years. This was no different in the realm of education. As Christians sought to make sense of their own command to shape and train and bring up their young, enculturate them into the culture of God's heavenly kingdom, they found and repurposed and redeemed and cleansed a ready set of tools that they found in the Greek educational tradition. Christians from the earliest times, even in the New Testament itself, offer neither a wholesale acceptance nor a wholesale rejection of the Greek ideal. Rather, they sought to rightly situate it, or you could say rightly appropriate it, and these tools within a Christian framework. So for Christians, the God who had created all things and revealed himself through Jesus Christ was the only source of human ideal that he had revealed himself through his word to be received by faith. Yet, God had given mankind specific faculties, a mind, affections, a will, that once enlivened by faith, were to be trained and disciplined and ordered according to God's truth, his goodness and his beauty. The story then of education in the West is the attempt of Christian thinkers to utilize these 7 arts or tools that had been established and given by the Greeks toward the end for which God created the world. This meant that the highest goal of humanity was to live an ordered life in every way, with our mind, our desires, our will, under the lordship of Christ Jesus, and to bring every part of our lives and to use every faculty available to bring those into conformity with his ways. Notice again that this end is neither economic nor utilitarian. It is an end ordered toward flourishing, not in consumption or in production, but in a life that is ordered according to God's ultimate reality, in knowledge, in virtue, and in our longings. Now, if you remember, if you were with us a couple lectures ago, there was a foundational cohesion that undergirded this worldview, the assumptions of what humans were for and what it takes for us to be conformed to that for nearly 1,500 years. So from the time Christianity meets this Greek influence until the Enlightenment and scientific revolution, this cohesive way of seeing the world goes predominantly unchanged. Likewise, many of the educational realities that undergirded how the young were enculturated, the enculturating of this worldview from generation to generation went unchanged. These assumptions were formed in people through worship and prayer, the rituals of the church, and at times, for some, through formal contexts where the faculties could be trained in pursuit of ordering one's life according to God's glorious truth. This actually produced a glorious heritage and a glorious shared set of cultural deposits in much of the Western world throughout this time. Although drastic changes have happened since the time of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution that have had profound implications on the unfolding state of how we make sense of the world and how we live in it. We talked about this again a couple lectures ago. We talked about the enthroned self. These, in turn, have dynamic and profound implications on education. And though we could tell the story from the Enlightenment up, I want to jump in our story to look at a few specifically radical turns in American educational history that have brought us to the place of our current crisis. So to do so, we have to look at several turnings that have happened in the conceptualization of education right here in America that have greatly affected our system of schooling, even our concept of what schooling or education is. These turns have taken particular shape, specifically in the post-World War II restructuring and ascendancy of America. The first turn happened right on the heels of World War II, when the American project began to gain global ascendancy and potency through economic expansion and nationalistic power. With the rapid rise of the consumer economy, think of refrigerators in your home and TVs in your home and cars in your driveway. With the rapid expansion of the American dream and the proliferation of the automobile, American society became highly structured around production and consumption. This led to a dynamic influence in the educational system, as economic and utilitarian elements of success began to flood the cultural vision of America. This led to many of the presuppositions that undergird how many of us presently think about education. Again, if humans are for, right, what is the good life? What is the end? Increasing their participation in a production-consumption economy, then the goal of education ought to be to give students the requisite information and skills required to gain and secure gainful employment, to be a contributing participant in this society. This time also saw the rapid rise in the percentage of people who attended college, as higher education became the standard currency for success in the American workforce. So the second turn then is directly tied to a philosopher of education by the name of John Dewey. Most of you are familiar with the fruit of his labors, the Dewey Decimal System. You saw it in the library in your school. Dewey was a highly influential figure in the history of American education and is considered by many to be the father of what is known as progressive education. And although he lived earlier at the turn of the 20th century, his ideas didn't actually find wholesale acceptance in the American education system until the late 80s and the 90s. Behind Dewey's system of education is a philosophical position known as pragmatism. This system of philosophy essentially seeks to counter long-held traditions that certain things are fixed and objective or perennially true. Dewey himself was highly influenced by the evolutionary theories of Charles Darwin and believed that all of human history, that reality of evolution and development should be applied to every area of human life, education included. Although Dewey was an ardent secularist, his concept of education almost takes on, as it should, because education is enculturation, it is at some level indoctrination. It takes on this like religious tone to it. For Dewey, the purpose of education is to train children to participate in a democratic or equalitarian society. This is not simply training children to participate in democratic forms of government, but a training children how to live in a world without all distinction. This leads to a belief that any objective truth, something that is perennially or permanently fixed, is by its nature authoritarian, oppressive, and against a truly equalitarian society. With this turn, the school, particularly the state-sponsored public school, was to become the primary institution that shaped and enculturated the young in society. Because of this, there is a specific and explicit work to reduce any educational value of families and churches or other social institutions in order that the child development experts could help develop children into purely equalitarian members of a society. The predominant effects of this turn have remained somewhat, for the most part, at the level of higher education. It's kind of cliche at this point, but you might think of the ever-increasing subjectivism, emotionalism, fragility that has come to mark so many students in the last several decades. Although not the explicitly aimed for outcome, much of these realities are the fruits of coming to bear of a subjectivist tendency in education that sought to promote unbridled freedom of thought and unbridled freedom of action that was unbound by any authoritarian structure. Now, the final turn that can be seen over the last decade or so is a growing turn towards what a thinker named James Lindsay has termed the Marxification of education. In this turn, the radical ideologies of Brazilian Marxist Paulo Freire have sought to permeate education with increasingly activistic and deconstructionistic tendencies within school systems. This system seeks to infuse into education an even more explicit move toward equalitarianism, but this time with a specific view toward tearing down the structures or the institutions that have for so long promoted inequalities and gross injustice and indoctrination. Side note, all the while doing this through indoctrination. Okay, so we need to tear down the indoctrination, which is indoctrination itself, okay? All education is enculturation. You cannot have a neutral education. I want to tell a few stories that will illustrate some of the more visible and somewhat humorous fruits of this shift as it's happened in American education. The first comes from the campus of Columbia this past April, when a group of students from the university forcibly entered and occupied Hamilton Hall, a building on Columbia's campus. The demonstration and occupation actually sparked and kicked off a much larger series of protests, many turning into long-standing student encampments all across college campuses in America, in response to Israel's retaliation against Palestine in the Gaza Strip. For several weeks, students all across the nation created these encampments and demanded that their universities and the American nation divest any and all interest in relation to Israel. Now, at the time, I remember watching a particularly amusing video from the occupation at Columbia in which a student spokesperson demanded that the university bring the students food and water. Now, these students had forcibly broken into a building that was closed, occupied it according to their own will. No authorities had forced them to remain in the building. No authorities were barring students from leaving or coming in to take food and water. Yet this spokesperson declared with verve and intensity that for the university to refuse to give the students food would be to withhold basic humanitarian aid in a time of crisis. The second comes from last week, when it was reported that several Ivy League schools set up self-care suites for students to come and process their emotions in light of the election results. Further reports of such non-threatening spaces being stocked with essentials such as Legos and crayons and milk and cookies, so that these human adults could navigate their emotional response to the election in ways that were safe and appropriate. I read of professors at Harvard and University of Pennsylvania, Michigan State, encouraging students to skip class in order to process their emotions. Again, another side note. I just got to interject these every now and again. One wonders if the same actions would be taken if the outcome would have been different, right? So we're watching the unfolding of what amounts to a radical revolution in the Western world broadly, and in the American education system in particular, that's come to bear over the last century. This radical revolution is rapidly producing an increasingly anti-Christian, anti-moral, anti-reason, radicalized social agenda, one that is progressive and left-leaning in its scope. Now, what I want us to see as we look at the fruits of these stories, the stories you hear of emotional fragility, the rise of victimhood culture, the propensities towards societal deconstruction, social revolution, these are not aberrations. These are the system producing exactly what it's designed to produce. To say it a little differently, the craziest elements of what we're seeing in education over the last several years, the stories you hear of drag queen story hour or horror stories of perverse, sexualized curriculum and books being brought into elementary contexts, these are not anomalies. They are the fruits coming to bear of seeds that were planted in the soil a long time ago. Again, this should sound wildly familiar. All of this has and should make Christians ask really serious questions about what we should do in times like this. We should be looking not just for places to find refuge from the most radical forms of this ideology, but for places to form and shape our children in time-honored ways that are more in line with what we believe and what Christians have handed down through the ages. One thing that we have lost as the people of God is the reality that we are at war. And one of the primary battlegrounds is education. I believe we must regain a vision for what it means to fight according to God's ways and for the purposes of God's kingdom, specifically as it relates to the bringing up of our children in the culture and the instruction of the Lord. And we'll look more at that in the second one. Thank you, guys.